Soft as the voice of an angel, breathing a lesson unheard. Hope with a gentle persuasion whispers her comforting word. Wait till the darkness is over. Wait till the tempest is gone. Hope for the sunshine tomorrow, after the shower is
There was once a man who really loved the American historical figure, George Washington. And so he tried to read everything he could get his hands on. When documentaries were aired, he would watch them. And then as a birthday gift, he was given a couple of tickets to two separate lectures on George Washington by leading historians. And so he went to both of those lectures. They were back-to-back, one night, one the next night, at one of the centers that focused on George Washington. And after he left the first lecture, the first night, he walked away completely blown away by the historian and by what the historian was able to bring out and just how smart the historian was. The fact that he brought out things nobody else knew. He was able to draw on sources that nobody else would touch, but that he was just super intelligent. But then he went to the second lecture the next night. And when he walked away, he didn't really mention the historian who gave the lecture. He was too blown away by who George Washington was as a man. His ability as a leader on the battlefield, now certainly George Washington had his faults, but he was too mesmerized by who he was as a man. You see, there's a difference between those two occasions and those two historians. One historian used George Washington as a means of pointing to himself. See, you could have inserted anybody else in that particular arena, but he would have used the individual to point to himself because he was trying to highlight what he knew and how smart he was and how he had learned things that other people had not known. But you see, the other historian didn't really care if people remembered who he was. He simply wanted people to walk away with an impression of George Washington that he had seen in interacting with him and studying his life. He wanted people to meet George Washington as much as humanly possible. And one of the things I think that points out is something that we have to be very cautious of as Christian people. We have to be extremely cautious that we don't use Jesus to point to ourselves and our goodness. And we want people to know all of the good things that we do and how intelligent we are. But rather we use ourselves to show people Jesus, to where God takes center stage and we're just kind of back here narrating what's going on. And I believe that's exactly what Jesus meant in this well-known text that was read for us a moment ago in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16, these well-known metaphors of salt and light that he used to describe what he wants his people to be like. And a basic premise behind it is of influence, that you're basically pointing people to God. That's what you're doing. And there are some nuances in salt and light, and we'll get into some of that, but the end goal is found in verse 16, right? You're to let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. That is, they see your work here, but their attention, their gaze moves from you to the heavens. That's what you're trying to accomplish. And so, as we think about this together, I want to first address a couple of principles that are important here. And then move into the picture that Jesus is giving us of salt and light and what do those things mean. And then close with a couple of points of practical application. But number one, I want us to look at some of these principles. And there are two principles, but they're both found in a commonly heard statement. Many people in this, I would say a majority of us in this room have heard something along these lines. Christians are to be in the world, but not of the world. People heard that? Am I the only person that's heard that? Okay. They're to be in the world, but not of the world. Now, in that statement, you have two principles that have to hold each other in tension. Okay? There's, first of all, the principle of connecting to people. That is, Christians have to be in the world. We have to connect to the world in certain ways, right? How else could you ever draw people and bring people to Christ if you have no connection with them? If you have no interaction with them? Okay? That's why Jesus was criticized in Luke 15, 1 and 2. They said he receives sinners and he eats with them. Well, anybody reading that goes, duh. He's here to seek and to save the lost. Why would he be amongst the righteous? Of course he's eating with them. He's connecting with them. And now here's something we have to understand too, that sometimes that text is used as cover for Christians engaging in immoral behavior. Listen, Jesus did sit and eat and was open to discuss and was compassionate towards sinners, but Jesus never engaged in their sin in order to reach them in their sin. And we have to understand that. You can be compassionate towards sin without engaging in sin. Okay? That's what Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 9 when he lists a number of different people, and he basically summed it up in 9:23, and he said, I've become all things to all men. That is, I will meet them where they are. I'll find a point of connection. And when you study the works of Paul and his missionary journeys and his extended interactions like Acts chapter 17, and you find that Paul, no matter what society he places himself in, no matter what their main goals are, he will meet them. He'll find what's called a point of connection. He'll find a point of connection, like in Acts chapter 17, when he said, even your own poets say what? We are the offspring of God. There's our point of connection. He has entered in. He's dealing with large-minded intellectuals. And so he says, let me appeal to one of your poets you hold in high regard. He said, but let me tell you, that God ought not to be thought of like the gods of gold and silver. You see what he does? He finds a point of connection, someone that they both read that they have in common. And now from that point of connection, he says, now let me show you why that is in confrontation with who God is. And therefore, once you understand the confrontation between what we understand and what you believe and who God is, then we now need to plug you into Jesus Christ. And so that's the mold of evangelism. You have to connect to people so that you can show them with Jesus. He connects with them, but there's also a point of contradiction between the two. And that if we want to be right, we have to merge ourselves down into where Jesus wants us to be. And so there is this importance of connecting to the world. But there's also the second principle of separating. We have to be separate from the world. Romans 12:1-2 says, don't be conformed to it, don't be pressed into the mold of the world, but be transformed by it. Be transformed from the world by God and through the renewing of our minds. Or 2 Corinthians chapter 6, when he gives tons of illustrations, when he says, what does this have to do with this? What fellowship does light have with darkness? And he gives about 6 or 7 different illustrations along those lines. And then he concludes by quoting the Old Testament, saying, come out from among them and be separate. We're to be different. And this is where a lot of well-meaning people in churches are making gigantic mistakes. They think that in order to reach the world, you have to connect with the world in the sense that you have to go along and do everything they want you to do in order to meet them, in order to connect to them. But they have understood one side of it. You have to connect to the world, but at the same time, you've got to be separate. Doesn't Jesus illustrate that? When he says, you are salt and you are light, but you're the salt of what? The earth. You're the light of the world. There's difference. You see, he's drawing, there are different camps here. And so, there has to be a separation. Now, the tension between these two principles has caused a lot of conflict for the people of God. First of all, you go back to Old Testament era when the children of Israel returned from captivity in Babylon, and then they go under, and they're under Persian captivity, and then they're under Greek captivity, and then they're under Roman captivity. And so the question then becomes, okay, how do we as the people of God stay true to God while still serving a government that cares nothing for our God? Well, the answer to that question is something we see on the pages of the New Testament, we just don't realize it. So, what happened was, you had schools of thought develop on this is how we interact with our conquerors, the people who are over us. So you had the group known as the Sadducees, and their goal basically was, well, if you can't beat them, join them. Let's just accept the culture, welcome it in with open arms, embrace Greek culture or Greco-Roman culture, and become like them. You had the Pharisees who said, no, we're going to separate from them. We cannot contaminate ourselves by going into, and so they said basically withdraw all together from Roman government. And then you got the Essenes who said, well, let's just leave everybody. You don't read about the Essenes in the New Testament. There's a reason why. Because they lived in monasteries out in the wilderness. They literally withdrew from society. They thought that they could get away from sin. The only problem is, where you have a person, you have sin. So even when you withdraw to a monastery, you just got a monastery of a smaller group of sinners. But that's how they dealt with it. All right? When we look at early centuries Christian writings and sermons from church fathers, one of the things we see that they confronted was the relationship of Christians with Roman gladiatorial games. Not just in the city of Rome, but these gladiatorial games were not just in the Colosseum in Rome. Each city had its own theater where they would do these things. And so you see in their sermons, when you read them, how they go about talking to the members of the congregation about what their relationship should be to these gladiatorial games. Or when you fast forward to, say, 14, 15, 1600s and the Puritan movement in England, how they protested and tried to get the local theaters shut down. Not just because of some of the plays that were being put on, but because some of the behavior and things that were associated that took place in the theaters. And so they protested. What is all this about? It's about dealing with this tension, isn't it? You're in the world, but you have to connect to the world, but at the same time, you have to be separate. So how does that work? One of my professors in school, Dr. Ed Gallagher, has written a book that's recently released on the Sermon on the Mount. And I believe that I want to read his statement about this tension because I believe it sums it up well for modern day, especially Southern Christians. He says this: how much should disciples of Jesus resemble the world around them? This perennial question has no easy answers. Due in part to their Christian beliefs, the Amish live very distinctive lives, much more distinctive than most conservative Christians would tolerate. Most of us think there's no problem with driving a car, having electricity, but we still struggle with which movies it's okay for a Christian to see, what kind of music we can listen to, or what clothing we can wear, or whether we can eat in a restaurant that has an open bar, or whether we can participate in mixed bathing. What he means there is the raging debate that exists a lot in Southern churches of should men and women in bathing suits be joined together in the same place and swimming together. And it's not the swimming, it's the apparel. Okay? That's the heated debate. Okay? School dances and all kinds of things. And so these things are existing, and there's this tension between them. Okay? And the war is raging because we're trying to walk this line of, yes, I'm supposed to be separate from the world, but at the same time I have to connect to the world. Listen, on these questions, I wished God would have simply spoken and said this. But he doesn't. Now, some of you probably listened to some of those things that Dr. Gallagher wrote talking about things we struggle with, and some people would look at them and go, that's ridiculous. Let me tell you something. If that's our attitude toward these issues, we need to recheck them. We need to recheck them. Because this is what scares me about someone who dismisses these discussions. It's because most of the time they believe that God has no right to speak into those areas of their lives. And that's wrong. We have to understand as Christians that what we do, God speaks into everything that we do. And whether we choose to engage in something or whether we choose to refrain in something, we better have biblical reasons why we choose to engage or we choose to refrain. That's called being a Christian. That's called being biblically minded, that everything you do is filtered through the eyes of God in Scripture. It has to be considered. But we also have to learn to live with differences of judgment. So you see this tension that exists. And some of those debates can get pretty ugly. We're not going into those debates this morning, obviously. Because it's missing the point of what Jesus is saying in this sermon. He's telling us we have to be able to walk this line. And as human beings, we want boxes. We want God to draw lines perfectly where we can see that this is exactly what we do. And but sometimes God doesn't draw those boxes. And we have to learn how to navigate them. Now, with those principles in mind, then we launch into what Jesus is going to say here about salt and light. Okay? These principles of connecting to the world, but at the same time remaining separate from the world. So here are his pictures, and they're very simple. Verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. Verse 14, you are the light of the world. And they're somewhat synonymous. That is, they're basically saying the same thing. You could make an argument, and this is a little bit biblical nerdy discussion, you could make an argument that one is a little bit more, it is actually called progressive parallelism. The Hebrews use something called Hebrew parallelism, where you see it a lot in Proverbs. Let's see, let me think. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Those two sentences, what are they saying? They're saying the same thing, right? They're saying it in two different ways, but that was their way of emphasizing it because they didn't have bold. If you and I want to emphasize something, we can put it in all bold letters, we can all caps it, we can underline it, we can put quotations around it. They didn't do that. So what they would do is either repeat the word or repeat the phrase several times, or they would repeat it back to back in order to emphasize. And so that's called Hebrew. It's called synonymous parallelism, where you say the same thing twice for sake of emphasis. But there's also another form of parallelism known as progressive, in which you say one thing in the first line, and the second line picks up on that theme, but it kind of advances that theme a little bit more, if that makes sense. Okay, and I'm not, when I say if that makes sense, I'm not saying you can't understand that. I'm saying my ability to explain it is not always the best. So you make a statement, and then you follow the statement by progressing the idea further down the road, okay, with further information. So there's an argument that could be made there, because the argument basically goes like this, that salt is more of the preservative element and light is more of the revelation element. That is, salt is a point of confrontation with the world, pointing out and preserving the world, but at the same time, light is a little bit bigger in its scope because it is helping people to see who God is. And so there may be some of that going on. I'm not exactly sure, to be honest with you. Now, this is what he says, first of all, as he turns our attention to salt. He simply makes a statement. You are the salt of the earth. Now, the word you in the original text here is first plural, okay? In Greek, there are two different words for, well, multiple. There are two different words for you. One is a singular form and one is a plural form, okay? That's a lot easier for us. In English, we have one word, and so you have to kind of determine by context, is he saying plural, is he saying singular? In Greek, you see the word, it's quite simple. This is plural. And so when he says you, or as we translated in Greek class, I don't know that's necessarily grammatically correct, we say y'all. That's the way it comes across. And yes, he does. He is a PhD and lets us translate y'all. It's okay, we get it. But the you is plural. Okay, so the idea is y'all. Then the word you, where the word you is placed in sentence. Now, I really didn't intend to go into this. What am I doing this? When you look at an English sentence, okay, when you look at an English sentence, we can pick out what is what in an English sentence, grammatically speaking, usually by its placement in the sentence. Your subject many times is going to be first in the sentence, right? Or somewhere toward the front end of the sentence. And you're going to see your predicates or your main verbs and your direct objects and indirect objects. You can figure some of that stuff out by the order of the sentence. In Greek, it is not like that, okay? Believe me, I wish it was. But one of the things that it does help is that in Greek, when you want to emphasize something, many times you will place that word first in the sentence to tell the person, this is what I'm emphasizing. And so what's going on here when he says you, this you is emphatic. He's trying to communicate to us maybe even what Jesus was saying when he communicated it, when he said, you are the salt of the earth. You are the salt of the earth, okay? Somebody's getting it. So he's emphasizing to those individuals in this context who would be his disciples, we are the salt of the earth, okay? Drawing our attention to that. Then he talks about salt. Let's talk about salt for a minute. Salt was actually a very important, precious commodity. We actually get our English word salary comes from the Latin word for salt, because salt was so important. Matter of fact, Roman soldiers were many times paid in salt. It was a precious commodity. And so Romans, of course, used Latin. That carries over. We get our English word for salary. And it had a lot of different purposes. It had a purity element. It was a preservative, obviously. It gave flavor to things. It was involved in healing. In some of the Napoleonic Wars, they would use salt to treat wounds. Create thirst, obviously. If you have too much salt, tongue get dry pretty quick and you'll be ready to choke something down. And then it was used also in reference to covenants. Like in Leviticus 2, God, when he gave the sacrifices, said you have to use salt in the sacrifice upon the altar because the salt was representative of the covenant. We don't have time to go into all that. But anyway, that's some of the different uses. But what is Jesus saying here? Okay? Because this is where you kind of... this is where we have to be cautious and study, okay? When we read a statement like, you are salt, some of the times what we're tempted to do is say, okay, but what does salt do? We think about salt in 21st century modern terms. And so we might list some characteristics of salt as we think of it in the 21st century and then say, oh, well, that's what Jesus meant. Does anybody see a potential problem with that? Because our understanding and our thoughts about salt may not be the same as theirs were. And so when we see Jesus say, you are salt, we can't ask ourselves what we think of as 21st century people of what salt is. We have to think about, how does the Bible use salt? How does Jesus use salt? How did they understand salt? And what Jesus is focusing on here about salt, I think, are at least two things. First of all, you have flavor. Okay? If the salt has lost its taste, or some translations will say flavor. So I think Jesus is telling us right there that one of the things he's pointing out is that salt has a taste, it has a flavor, a different taste or flavor. Okay? But also it's used in a preservative form. That was when you don't have modern day refrigeration like we do. If you've ever visited some old colonial homes or plantations and you see the way they would work the water into certain portions of, they'd have a little cooling element set up down there toward the water, but it wasn't perfect. I mean, it was pretty bad actually, but it was what they had. And so salt was a main preservative. And so when Jesus is saying here, you are salt, there is a sense of flavor to it. That, look, when people look at everything that's going on in the world, they can see people like them anywhere they turn. You want to give them a different flavor? You want to show them something different? Be a disciple of Jesus. Show them something that they're not used to tasting. Why doesn't this person react this way when this happens to him or her, when everybody else reacts this way? Why does this person not do these things or say these things when everybody else does them in those same situations? There's got to be a different flavor. There's also a preservative element to it. What is it that, it kind of goes toward one of the functions of the church being a conscience of the culture. This is what happens. This is one of the dangers, by the way, of modern social media because it creates echo chambers. We only follow and we only listen to the people who agree with us. That's a really, really dangerous thing to do. Because it means you only hear people who think and do and say and believe things the way you believe them. And so your thoughts are never actually challenged. You don't need to live in an echo chamber. You need to live in our world where people are different. And people have different beliefs and different judgments. So that you can come to a fuller understanding of things. And so when he's here talking about this preservative element, if you have a culture, and that culture, they're all the same, and they're all the same in their sinfulness, and the church does not exist in that culture, their sinfulness will rapidly increase. But in cultures where you have churches, you will find that their sinfulness doesn't necessarily increase as rapidly because that church plays as a conscience to the culture. People in that culture become Christians. They change the way they think. They change the way they live. They change the way they act. That influences other people. It puts a different voice into a sinful culture. And so when he's calling on us to be salt, there's a preservative element to that. It's supposed to help prevent the decay of society. The solutions to problems in America will never be putting more law enforcement on the street, although that's something that has to be done. But the solution is not putting more people with guns on the street, it's putting more people that have Jesus inside of them on the streets, that make those things unnecessary. It's about putting more Christians on streets. That's how you change cultures. So, he says you're salt. Then he asks this rhetorical question, but if the salt has lost its flavor, can it regain its saltiness? How shall the saltiness be restored? It's a rhetorical question. It can't. First of all, salt does not lose, if you leave salt alone, it will not lose its flavor on its own most of the time. Salt can lose its flavor if you mix it with impurities. If you get enough impurities in there and you mix it up enough, you can rob it of its taste. You can rob it of its worth. That's what Jesus is saying. You're the salt of the earth, but now here's our separation principle, right? How does the salt lose its taste? By mixing in impurities. And we have to be careful about our interactions with the world. We have to keep that separateness. We have to connect to them, but we have to keep that separateness. Otherwise, we're going to end up being and doing exactly what they do. It's amazing to me when you study religious trends in America right now, the churches that are declining the fastest are the churches that are giving in to the moral demands of society. Because when you go along with society, nobody needs you. The churches that are staying the truest to biblical pattern are actually increasing at astronomical rates. Because they're doing what God told them to do. They're being salt. But if you lose it, it's no longer good for anything except you throw it out, which is a term of judgment in Matthew. You see it a lot even in this sermon we don't have time to look at. And so it's just trampled under people's feet. You just throw it on the ground and nobody really pays attention to it. They just walk all over it. Your influence is gone. Christians have to be concerned with their influence. There are certain things that we have to understand that even if inherently it might not be wrong to do them, if it costs me an influence for Christ, it's just not worth it. I mean, it really just isn't worth it. But that's sometimes where our American ideas, they run amok over us. I've got rights. You can't tell me I can't do this. Well, technically, no, it's not wrong. But is it really worth losing your influence over people that you could help and draw them to Jesus? Is giving up something really that important to you? That one thing is more important than leading 10 people to Jesus? Are you kidding? Then quickly he moves to light. Salt, you got a job. Help preserve the element. Help draw people to Jesus. Then in the light, he makes the same statement, identical. It's plural and emphatic. You are the light of the world. Light has a lot of uses in Scripture, has about 8 or 9. I think what Jesus has in mind here is 3 things. First of all, he has the idea of hope. If you back up in the context of Matthew to chapter 4, verses 16 and 17, he talks about the people in the land of Naphtali and Dan who had sat in darkness, but now they have seen a great light, talking about the ministry of Jesus taking place in their locale. And so light is a symbol of hope. You're in the midst of darkness, and then you see a glimmer of light. There's hope. Okay? It's also the idea, obviously, of influence. Isaiah 42:6 and Isaiah 49:6, God used the nation of Israel and his special servant, I think is probably a reference to Jesus in one of those contexts, to be a light to the Gentiles. That is, to draw the Gentile world into God by what he saw them doing in his people and their differences. But also, light is used in terms of revelation. You enlighten someone. What are you doing? You've revealed something to them that helps them to understand, to open up. And so what is he saying here about that? Well, he gives a couple illustrations. First, he gives an exterior illustration. He said, look, you're like a city that's on a hill. You can't hide it, okay? You can't hide it, especially in those cultures. I mean, you'd go out in the middle, you'd be wandering between valleys and hills and deserts, and then you see a city on a hill. You can't hide the light. Even if there was a mandatory blackout, there's always going to be that one person with a candle burning, and people are going to see it. What is he saying? You can't hide it. You're going to be an influence, and you can't hide it. He gives a similar illustration on the interior. What does he say? Look, when you light a candle in your home, you don't take it and put a mixing bowl over the top of it. I'm obviously translating into 21st century what he's saying. Put it under a bushel. That they would go to get certain things and cook with and things along that line. You don't take the bowl and then put it on top of the lamp. Why? It's your only light source. It's foolish. So you have to, your light is one that must continually shine. And so he says, it gives light to all that are in the house. And then he comes to his conclusion, which is this: let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Now notice, he says, let your light shine, but there is a difference between letting your light shine and shining your light in people's faces. He's actually going to deal with that concept in chapter 6, right? Chapter 6, 1 through 18. Oh, I want everybody to look how much money I'm donating. Pharisees would literally walk around praying like this and running into stuff just because they wanted people to know they were praying. I'm not making that up. Whew, man, am I hungry. Well, why are you hungry? Well, let me tell you, I've been fasting a long time. That's shining your light in people's face. Let me give you a simple illustration. We go into a restaurant somewhere, and as will inevitably happen, we sit down at the table. Brooke looks a lot younger than I do. I'm older. So we seem somewhat, I guess, I don't know to some people. I don't know what they think. But anyway. Would y'all like something from the bar? Oh, no, we don't do that now. We're Christians. We're not those kind of people. Y'all need to shut that thing down. That's shining your light in somebody's face. You could just say, no, thank you. I'll have Coke, please. Shining your light in somebody's face, you will never, ever win someone that way. Listen, I don't agree with drinking alcohol. That's not a secret. And I have more reasons than just biblical. Alcoholism ran rampant in my family, and I've seen what it does. I have no time for it whatsoever. I understand people struggle with it. I'm not saying that they're terrible people, and I'm not saying that I'm better than them because I don't do it. I'm saying I think it's a problem. Biblically, I think there are biblical reasons why it's a problem. I think there are problems, just interactions, things you see that you can't unsee, that it's a problem. But I can tell you this. We won't ever reach anyone if we play the self-righteous card and we drive people into the ground. That's not what Jesus is calling on us to do here. Just be light. That's his point. Be salt. Be light. Just point people to God. It doesn't matter. Listen, my favorite preacher on this planet is one of the smartest men I've ever met. But that's not why he's my favorite preacher. That's not why he's my favorite preacher. He is my favorite preacher for two reasons. One is primary and one is far secondary. He's my favorite preacher because, number one, I know when I go and listen to him, I'm going to learn something. That's secondary. But primary, I know that when he is done, I will have looked God in the face and seen my God for who he is. He lets it shine, and it illuminates the face of Jesus. Not taking it like a floodlight and ramming it in your eye. That's what we're being called to do. Point people to God. Point people to God. You know what that does when you remain respectful and somebody comes along and says, hey, why don't you do that? Well, look, anytime you want to sit down and talk, I'd be happy to give you the reasons why I don't do that. Why did you respond that way? Well, listen, let's not make this a big public thing. If you want to talk about why I did that, we can talk about that, but let's do it a little bit later when nobody's around, and we'll talk about why that was. Those are moments where people see what we're doing and they say, why are you doing that? Why are you not doing that? They see the difference. And then they come asking, and then you say, that's why. I want to close with two practical points. The first question is, are we fulfilling the mission of God of being salt and light when people look at our lives? And we'll get more into that here in just a second. I want to read you two statements that I found extremely important, I thought, on this subject. He says, the salt and light metaphors reveal that the church's fundamental task is to mediate God's presence as priest and to rule on behalf of God, serving God and God's mission. Our task is to represent God, to mediate God's goodness, God's grace, God's holiness, and God's justice to the world as those who represent God. Salt and light, then, are not just what we do, but who we are. We have to come to a point to where doing the right thing is not even really something we even think about. It's just something we automatically do. You remember Matthew 25 when Jesus commends that group of people? He says, I was hungry and you gave me a drink. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. And you remember what their response was? Lord, when did that happen? What are they telling us? It was just normal to them. It's who they had become. They just took care of people. They didn't think of it as some grand gesture. They just did the right thing. Here's another statement we need to pay close attention to in the political spectrum. When society does go bad, we Christians tend to throw up our hands in pious horror and reproach the non-Christian world. That is, look how terrible the world is. Look how far it is going. But should we not rather reproach ourselves? No one blames unsalted meat for going bad. It can't really do anything else. The point he's making is this. You're getting mad at the world for doing what the world does. The world gets worse and worse and worse. That's what the world does. No one blames unsalted meat for going bad. It can't do anything else. The real question to ask is what? Where's the salt? We want to look at the state of a nation and a community and we want to blame everybody else except ourselves. When they're going into sinfulness the way God said they would, and we sit on our hands and complain that righteousness is not being upheld, but we won't take righteousness to the ends of the earth. And part of the reason is we think if we get the right people in office, it's going to turn everything around and we're going to be saved. Listen, there is no political figure that will save us. I don't care what party he or she is from, they will not save us. We have a Savior, and his name is Jesus Christ, and we need to hold him high. Final question is this. When people look at your life, when they look at my life, is my example a hindrance or a help in bringing people to Jesus? There's somebody at your job, there's somebody at school with you, and they're going through some hard things in life. They may not even know you all that well. But they know they need some help, and they know they need to turn somewhere. Are you the person they would come to? One of the hardest statements I ever read was in a book a number of years ago. When a man pointed out in his writings, he said, "Don't you think it strange that the people who felt most comfortable being around Jesus feel the least comfortable being around his people?" Why were sinners drawn to Jesus? Apparently he had a heart for them. These are hard questions. But before God, we must wrestle with them. We must. Because it's what Jesus said we're to do. One of the things every commentator said when commenting on this passage was this. They said it's quite amazing that Jesus would entrust such a high calling to such a struggling group of people. He expects it of us. This morning, our greatest desire is for you to know Jesus, to point you to him. The truth of the matter is this: every one of us sin. Every one of us has sinned. It's of an age of accountability and of the mental state to be able to do so. And God, in his holiness, cannot allow that sin to go unpunished. And so there are two options here. Either you can bear your own punishment before God, or you can come to Jesus who has already borne it for you. That's the gospel. He died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. With a penitent faith, confessing him to be immersed in water, because Romans 6:3-4 says that we're reenacting the gospel. We're dying to our sins, we're being buried, and we're rising to walk in a new life the same way Jesus died, was buried, and rose again. Be a New Testament Christian. Maybe as a New Testament Christian, our example is not what it needs to be. I think every one of us could say that, if we're being honest. Maybe we need to talk about it, pray about it, whatever it is. We just want to help one another. If we can help you this morning, let us know as we stand and sing this song.
Sinking to rise no more. But the master of the sea heard my despairing cry. From the waters lifted me, now safe am I. Love lifted me, love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me, love lifted me, love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me. Souls in danger, look above, Jesus completely saves. He will lift you by his love out of the angry waves. He's the master of the sea, billows his will obey. He, your Savior, wants to be saved today. Love lifted me, love lifted me. When nothing else could